My name is Ethan Cole, and before the prison number replaced my name, before betrayal rewrote my destiny, I was just a simple man who believed love alone could conquer everything. Lena was my entire world from the second I met her. She had ambition in her eyes and fire in her soul, and I saw my future in the way she dreamed out loud about business, independence, and success. Before we continue with the story, kindly support the channel by hitting the like button, sharing this video, subscribing, and commenting where you're watching from. I worked 2 jobs just to support her dream, not because she asked me to, but because I believed a man's greatest pride was building a future with the woman he loved. We started with nothing but belief, and I was proud of that nothing because it was ours. What I didn't know, what nearly destroyed my life, was that Lena's small import business was quietly bleeding money. At first, she only mentioned minor losses, delayed payments, and temporary setbacks. But behind my back, debts were stacking higher than I could imagine. Loans. Interest. Silent investors demanding returns. She smiled in my face every night while panic was slowly eating her alive. I trusted her so completely that I never once checked the accounts myself. And that blind trust became the doorway through which disaster walked right into my life, smiling like destiny itself. Her boss, Mr. Vaughn, was the kind of man everyone feared and respected at the same time. He controlled contracts, financing, and opportunities like a king controlling land. When Lena came to him for help behind my back, he saw more than a struggling employee, he saw leverage. He offered her a lifeline, but lifelines from men like him always come with hooks. He told her the debt could be erased, the creditors silenced, and her business preserved. But someone had to take responsibility for the fraud tied to those loans. And that someone, he suggested, could be me. The night Lena finally broke down and told me everything, I remember feeling like the room was shrinking around me. Her tears soaked my shirt as she confessed the full mountain of debt she had buried herself in. She kept saying she was sorry, that she was afraid I would leave her if I found out the truth. I didn't even get angry. Fear for her future drowned every other emotion. Then she told me Mr. Vaughn's solution. That if I confessed to being the mastermind behind the financial manipulation, everything would disappear. No debt. No prison for her. Just me. I won't pretend I decided immediately. I paced the floor like a trapped animal that night, running numbers in my head, imagining courtrooms, cells, and my own name dragged across records forever. But every time I looked at Lena's trembling hands and swollen eyes, every calculation collapsed into one truth: I loved her more than I loved my freedom. I told myself prison was temporary. Love, I believed, was permanent. I told myself a man could survive a cell but not the guilt of abandoning the woman he promised to protect. By dawn, I had already chosen my fate. Walking into that police station felt like walking into my grave while still breathing. I sat under harsh white lights and explained a crime I never truly committed in full detail: wire transfers, falsified records, under-the-table payments. I spoke as if I had rehearsed it my entire life. The officers didn't doubt me for a second. It was too clean. Too detailed. They saw a desperate man trying to save himself from guilt, not a husband drowning in loyalty. When they placed the cuffs on my wrists, the metal felt heavier than iron, it felt permanent. By the time the story hit public records, my name had already become poison. "Local man admits to financial fraud," the headline said. Lena stood in the background of one article crying, painted as the innocent wife betrayed by her own husband. I watched it all unfold through a fog of shock and disbelief. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Friends vanished without explanation. And just like that, I became a criminal in the eyes of the world, sentenced not only to prison time but to social erasure. I had never felt so alone while still surrounded by people. The last thing Lena said to me before they closed the prison gate is what kept me alive during my darkest nights. Through tears, shaking hands, and trembling lips, she promised she would wait for me. She swore she would protect what was left of our life. She told me no matter how long it took, she belonged to me and only me. Those words became my oxygen in the cell. I repeated them in my head when loneliness tried to suffocate me. I had no idea those same words would later become the deepest stab in my back. Prison does not soften anyone. The first few nights were filled with sounds I will never forget: shouting, metal doors crashing, men crying when they thought no one could hear them. I slept with one eye open, clutching my thin blanket like armor. I told myself over and over that this was temporary. I reminded myself that love was waiting on the other side of these walls. That belief was the only thing that kept me from mentally collapsing in those early days. Hope was the only possession they hadn't yet taken from me. Even then, in those earliest weeks of my sentence, I began to sense a strange emptiness growing where Lena's presence used to live in my chest. The letters arrived late. The calls became shorter. Her voice sounded distracted, distant, as though she was already standing on the other side of my life. I ignored the warning signs because love makes cowards of smart men. I chose to believe the lie that sacrifice always produces loyalty. I didn't yet understand that sometimes sacrifice only teaches people how much they can take from you. The first few months after I entered prison were the only time Lena truly acted like the woman I believed I had married. She wrote letters almost every week, filling pages with words about faith, patience, and promises that she would never abandon me. She described her days in detail: how she went to work, how she prayed for me every night, how she was fighting to keep our small apartment and our remaining savings intact. I would read her words slowly, sometimes multiple times, letting each sentence sink into the cracks of my loneliness. Those letters were the last thin thread connecting me to the man I used to be, the man who still believed loyalty was sacred. Our phone calls became my lifeline. Every time my name was called for the phone line, my heart raced like a free man running toward open daylight. I would cling to every second of her voice, memorizing her breathing, her pauses, the way she tried to sound strong while hiding her fear. She told me she was struggling to cover bills alone, that life without me felt empty and overwhelming, that my absence had exposed how fragile everything truly was. I would apologize endlessly for what she was enduring, still believing I deserved every ounce of suffering while she was the innocent victim paying my sins. But after a few months, the rhythm of her commitment began to stagger. Calls that once came twice a week dropped to once every 2 weeks. Letters that arrived consistently began coming sporadically, sometimes weeks late. When I asked if everything was okay, she blamed work stress, exhaustion, emotional overload. I accepted every excuse without resistance because doubting her felt like betraying the very sacrifice I made. I told myself distance was normal. I told myself prison always complicates love. What I didn't allow myself to imagine was that her loyalty was already changing ownership. The first time she missed a scheduled visit without notice, I sat on the cold bench in the visiting hall long after the guards had cleared the room. Other inmates left with disappointment on their faces, but I stayed frozen, convinced there had been a mistake. I replayed her last words in my head: "I'll be there, I promise." When I returned to my cell that night, silence followed me like a shadow. She called days later with a rushed apology, claiming transportation issues and work conflicts. I forgave her instantly, desperate to believe the version of her that still lived in my memory. Around that time, something else changed that I couldn't immediately explain. Lena's voice on the phone had shifted. The warmth had been replaced with nervous efficiency. She spoke faster, offered fewer emotional details, and always seemed in a hurry to hang up. When I asked if she was eating well, if she was sleeping okay, she answered with short reassurances that felt rehearsed. I sensed another presence in her life, not a name, not a face, but a space where I no longer stood alone in her thoughts. Still, I swallowed my instincts and clung to blind faith. Money became the next shadow that crept into our conversations. At first, she said the savings were holding. Then she said inflation had made things harder. Then she said some funds had to be used to stabilize business expenses. Each time, she spoke in a careful tone, as if choosing every word to avoid revealing too much. I reminded her gently that we needed to protect what little future we had left. She assured me she was doing her best. What she didn't tell me was how often Mr. Vaughn's name was now filling the spaces where mine once lived. One evening during a call, she accidentally slipped. She mentioned that he had helped her renegotiate a supplier contract. I asked who she meant, and she fell silent for just a second too long. Then she said Mr. Vaughn had simply offered professional advice since he felt responsible for the situation. I thanked him through her, still seeing him as a distant figure with influence but no personal threat. I had no idea that during those private meetings, sympathy had already transformed into emotional dependence, and emotional dependence was quietly hardening into something far more dangerous. As weeks turned into months, visits disappeared entirely. Lena stopped scheduling them, always claiming emergencies. The phone calls kept shrinking until sometimes a full month passed without hearing her voice. My anxiety grew into something physical, a constant weight on my chest that made breathing feel unnatural. I started pacing my cell at night, replaying every moment of our marriage, searching for the exact point where love must have begun leaking out. But every time fear tried to shape itself into suspicion, I crushed it with desperate optimism. Prison teaches men strange disciplines. One of them is learning how to survive emotional starvation. I began waking before dawn, exercising until my muscles burned, just to exhaust the thoughts that tried to poison my spirit. During the day, I buried myself in whatever books I could find, not because I had changed my vision yet, but because stillness made betrayal feel louder. At night, when silence fell like a heavy blanket over the prison block, I would still whisper Lena's name like a prayer, as if faith alone could force her back into the woman she used to be. Then the letters stopped completely. No explanation. No final goodbye. Nothing. Days passed. Then weeks. I wrote again and again, filling page after page with worry, love, and unanswered questions. None were returned. I told myself mail delays were common. I told myself something temporary had interrupted her routine. But dread doesn't need proof to grow, it feeds on uncertainty, and mine was now endless. Every unanswered letter felt like a door closing gently, quietly, without ceremony. The truth was already moving closer to me like an approaching storm, but at that time I only felt the pressure in the air. I still believed the woman I loved was merely lost for a moment, that life had tired her, that my absence had shaken her. I never once imagined that while I was counting days on a prison calendar, she was already rewriting our entire story without me as the main character. I still didn't know that the promise she made at the prison gate had already expired without notice. The day everything finally collapsed arrived without drama, without warning music, without the kind of signs people think tragedy announces itself with. It was an ordinary prison morning, gray like thousands before it, heavy with routine and boredom. After breakfast, I stood in line to check my inmate account because Lena had promised weeks earlier that she would send something to help me buy basic necessities. I wasn't even expecting much, just enough for soap, stationery, and maybe a few extra food items. When the officer slid the printed balance toward me, I looked at the numbers once, then again, convinced my eyes had failed me. The screen showed 0. Not low. Not almost empty. 0. At first I assumed there had been a mistake in processing the deposit. I stepped out of line and returned, thinking the system had glitched. The same result stared back at me like an accusation I didn't understand. My throat tightened as I asked the officer to double-check the joint account linked to my inmate profile. He pressed a few keys, barely looking at me, then folded his arms and said the words that changed everything, "There's nothing there anymore." It was cleared out. My mind refused to accept the meaning behind those words. Cleared out didn't make sense. That account contained everything we had built together, our emergency savings, the money for our future apartment upgrade, the funds we once talked about using for children someday. That account wasn't just numbers. It was time. It was sacrifice. It was years of double shifts, postponed vacations, second-hand furniture, skipped pleasures. I returned to my cell shaking, convinced there had to be an explanation that did not involve betrayal. I requested phone access immediately and waited in line with a sickness in my stomach that refused to settle. When my turn finally came, I dialed Lena's number with trembling fingers, expecting relief the moment I heard her voice. It rang until the automated system cut me off. I tried again. Voicemail. A third time. Voicemail again. I left a message, trying to sound calm, explaining that there must have been a mistake with the bank. I asked her to please call me back because I was scared and confused. That call was never returned. Hours passed. Then the rest of the day. Then the night. The next day I tried again. No answer. I sent letters through expedited prison mail, explaining the missing funds, begging for clarity, apologizing in advance in case I had misunderstood something. Days turned into a week without any response. The silence pressed against my chest harder than the prison walls themselves. I began to lose sleep, replaying the last words we had exchanged, searching obsessively for any hint that this was coming. Then the truth arrived through a source I never expected. One of the inmates who worked in the prison library called me over one evening while the television played quietly in the background. The news channel was streaming a local business feature, the kind no one usually paid attention to. I barely looked at the screen until my breath caught violently in my chest. There she was. Lena. Smiling. Dressed in white. Standing beside a man in an expensive suit. A banner beneath the screen announced an engagement celebration involving Mr. Vaughn's company. My body locked in place while the reporter spoke about wealth, expansion, and a power couple emerging from strategic business alliances. I couldn't hear anything clearly beyond the thundering in my ears. The camera zoomed in on Lena's hand as she held up a ring that looked like it cost more than everything we once owned combined. The woman who had promised to wait for me, the woman who swore our suffering was temporary, was now publicly celebrating a future she built on top of my remains. I don't remember sitting down, but I remember being on the floor. I remember my hands shaking uncontrollably and my vision narrowing into something distant and unreal. Other inmates stared but said nothing. Some of them had seen this kind of collapse before. They knew better than to disturb a man meeting the full weight of his betrayal. In that moment, the missing money made sense. The late calls made sense. The unanswered letters made sense. The silence had simply been separation papers delivered without ink. Pain is not loud at first. Shock is quiet. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply felt hollow, as if someone had opened my chest and scooped out every organ responsible for feeling. That night in my cell, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while images from the broadcast replayed themselves without permission, her smile, the ring, the confidence in her posture as she stood beside the man whose debt had put me in prison. The next morning, grief finally found its voice. It rose from somewhere so deep inside me that it felt ancient. My chest ached as though something physical were tearing inside it. I pressed my face into the thin pillow to muffle the sounds I couldn't swallow. I cried for the man I used to be. I cried for the future I would never live. I cried because I finally understood the full price of sacrificial love in a world that values survival over loyalty. The woman I went to prison for had not waited a year before turning my sentence into her freedom. Anger followed grief like a storm follows pressure. It came slowly but grew heavy and suffocating as it expanded. I replayed every promise she ever made, every tear she shed before the prison gates closed behind me. I imagined her rehearsing those emotions, perfecting the performance that kept me docile and obedient while she built a new life with my money and my sacrifice as her foundation. Rage burned through my veins so violently I feared I might lose control of myself completely. Yet beneath the anger, beneath the grief, beneath the betrayal, something else was beginning to awaken. It wasn't hope. It wasn't forgiveness. It was awareness. The realization that love, untreated by wisdom, becomes a liability. The realization that I had given everything without securing even a fraction in return. The realization that pain, when allowed to settle instead of explode, can become fuel instead of fire. That night I sat on my prison bed and understood something that would shape the rest of my life: no one was coming to save me now. If I wanted to live again, I would have to invent a new version of myself without permission from the past. From that day forward, I stopped writing to Lena. I stopped waiting for updates. I stopped checking the mail with expectation. I stopped counting days backward to a reunion that would never happen. For the first time since my sentence began, I looked at time not as punishment but as raw material. Every hour became something I could either waste or convert. I chose to convert it. Not into revenge yet. Not into wealth yet. But into quiet, invisible preparation. The kind no one notices until it arrives fully formed. What Lena didn't know when she emptied that account and stood smiling beside my boss was that she had unknowingly funded the death of the man who loved her blindly. In his place, something harder had begun to assemble itself inside my chest. Something patient. Something deliberate. Something that no longer believed promises at face value. Something that understood that survival in the real world required more than faith, it required strategy. And I had just been handed the harshest lesson of my life for free. Something in me hardened permanently after that night. The tears eventually stopped, not because the pain left, but because pain had finally finished teaching me its first lesson. I stopped wasting energy on why Lena did what she did and started asking what kind of man I would become because of it. Prison suddenly looked different to me. It was no longer just a cage, it became a closed training ground where distractions were limited and time was abundant. I began to observe the men around me not as fellow prisoners, but as stories, warnings, and possibilities. Everyone there had lost something. The difference was what they chose to build from the wreckage. I started in the prison library with the hunger of a man who had lost everything and refused to die empty. At first, I read blindly, grabbing anything related to money, law, psychology, and business. Most of it went over my head, but I kept reading anyway, forcing my brain to stretch beyond the small world I once thought was enough. I learned how debt truly works, how interest enslaves quietly, how contracts hide violence behind polite language, and how wealth almost never comes from effort alone but from leverage. Each new concept felt like discovering a weapon I never knew existed. It was in that library that I met an old inmate named Walter, a man whose back was bent from time but whose mind was sharper than most men I had ever met outside these walls. Before prison, he had worked in asset management and private equity. His crime had been trusting the wrong partner. One day he noticed the stack of investment books I carried and smiled the way men smile when they recognize obsession. He asked me a few questions, and within minutes, he knew how little I truly understood. But instead of mocking me, he offered me guidance without charging anything except commitment. Walter became my informal professor. Every evening after work detail, I sat across from him in the quiet corner of the block while he broke down financial systems in simple language. He explained how wealth moves like water, always flowing toward the easiest opening. He explained that money itself is not power, but control over movement is. He taught me how markets are driven not by numbers but by fear, greed, and timing. He taught me that most people work for money, but the wealthy force money to work for them. Every lesson felt like my old life peeling off piece by piece. The more I learned, the more I realized how unprepared I had been when I entered the real world the first time. Love had made me generous, but ignorance had made me dangerous to myself. I began to reconstruct my understanding of trust, value, and risk from scratch. Instead of dreaming about a future built on emotion, I started imagining one built on structure. Instead of fantasizing about happiness, I began engineering survival. The bitterness inside me slowly transformed into discipline. I woke up earlier, trained harder, studied longer. Other inmates thought I was punishing myself. They didn't understand I was rebuilding myself. Months passed, and my body changed alongside my mind. My posture straightened. My voice steadied. My thoughts slowed into something controlled and deliberate. I no longer reacted emotionally to prison politics. I observed quietly. I listened more than I spoke. In that silence, I learned how men deceive, how alliances form and dissolve, how people reveal their intentions without realizing it. I learned that desperation makes men loud, but power makes them calm. I began to cultivate calm in everything I did. Not because I felt powerful yet, but because I intended to. I also began writing plans in coded form in my notebooks, hidden between the margins of ordinary sketches and random sentences. Plans about industries I would target one day, skills I would acquire, relationships I would build after release. I mapped business models I barely understood yet, trusting that understanding would catch up to ambition. I built timelines that stretched far beyond my sentence, reminding myself that the world outside was still moving and that I would need to re-enter it not as a victim begging for space, but as a man arriving with intention. At night, when the block fell silent and the lights dimmed, I sometimes allowed myself to imagine Lena's life without me, not with longing anymore, but with distance. I imagined her surrounded by luxury she hadn't earned with her own suffering. I imagined her believing the worst of my sentence was finished simply because I was gone. Instead of anger, those thoughts now fed my patience. I no longer wanted confrontation. I wanted positioning. I no longer imagined exposing her. I imagined surpassing her. There is a deeper revenge than destruction, it is irrelevance. By the time my release date was officially set, I was no longer afraid of freedom. I didn't see it as return. I saw it as deployment. I had entered prison as a husband trying to protect his marriage. I was leaving it as a man prepared to protect nothing but his future. Lena, Mr. Vaughn, the stolen money, the betrayal, all of it had ceased to be emotional weight and had become strategic context. They were no longer my wound. They were simply part of the story I would one day finish on my terms. The day I walked out of prison did not feel like victory. There were no crowds, no tears of joy, no arms waiting to pull me back into a life that had been paused. The gate opened with its usual mechanical indifference, and I stepped into sunlight that felt unfamiliar on my skin. I stood there with a small plastic bag containing my prison documents and a few personal items that no longer felt like they belonged to me. Everyone else who had ever promised to be there was absent. No Lena. No friends. No family. Just open space and the quiet realization that freedom without foundation can feel just as terrifying as confinement. The outside world moved faster than I remembered. Cars flashed past with drivers who had no idea a man was standing nearby rebuilding himself from zero without their permission or awareness. I rented the smallest room I could afford using a temporary re-entry voucher and slept on a mattress that sank in the middle like it was exhausted from carrying too many broken people before me. That first night, I lay awake listening to unfamiliar city noises, feeling like a stranger in the same streets I once walked confidently as a husband with dreams and direction. Now, everything felt unclaimed and uncertain. I searched for work the next morning with no pride left to lose. The criminal record followed me everywhere like a shadow that spoke before I did. Doors closed politely. Some didn't bother being polite at all. I took jobs that no one wanted, cleaning warehouses at night, lifting boxes until my arms burned, standing in cold storage spaces where time seemed to freeze along with the air. Every dollar I earned felt painfully small, but I treated it with the seriousness of an investment empire. I budgeted with precision, recording every expense, every cent of progress. At night, when exhaustion tried to silence me, I forced myself to study again. The world had not paused while I was incarcerated, it had advanced. Technology had shifted markets. New industries had risen. Old models had adapted. I read about digital trading, online businesses, emerging financial instruments, and the psychology of consumer behavior in a connected economy. I treated learning like oxygen. I understood now that survival depended not just on effort, but on relevance. And relevance only belongs to those who evolve faster than their circumstances. I sometimes passed public screens that displayed business news in shopping centers and transport stations. One evening, I saw Lena and Mr. Vaughn featured in a brief segment about corporate expansion and philanthropic initiatives. They stood in front of cameras like royalty, speaking about growth, opportunity, and vision. She looked polished, confident, untouched by the suffering my absence once supposedly caused her. The pain still tried to rise in my chest, but it no longer owned me. I looked at that screen not with longing or rage, but with calculation. Everything visible can be measured. Everything measured can be moved. Failure became my daily companion during those early years of freedom. I tried small online ventures that collapsed within weeks. I invested in digital assets that lost value overnight. I trusted partnerships that dissolved just before profit. Every setback drained money and energy, but not direction. I remembered Walter's voice in my head reminding me that the only real difference between men who fail permanently and men who rise eventually is whether they treat failure as identity or as tuition. I chose tuition. Every mistake taught me something I could not afford to ignore again. Slowly, patterns began to change. A small trading strategy one had tested for months finally started returning consistent profit. Nothing spectacular at first, just steady enough to signal that the system was valid. I scaled it cautiously. A freelance consulting project connected me to someone who later introduced me to a startup founder who needed silent capital. The investment performed far beyond expectations. The numbers on my screen grew larger than what I once believed was possible for a man in my position. For the first time since my arrest, the future started responding to my effort. Years passed without ceremony, marked only by rising figures, expanding networks, and a quiet transformation no one but me truly witnessed. My clothing changed from necessity to quality. My living space expanded from survival to comfort. My name was still unknown to the people who once erased me, and I intended to keep it that way. I formed a private investment entity through legal channels and intermediaries. My face remained absent from public records connected to finance. Anonymity became my shield. Power moves best when it is unseen. I understood then that walking out of prison with nothing had been necessary. Had I left with bitterness alone, it would have poisoned my rebuilding. Had I left with entitlement, it would have made me reckless. But leaving with emptiness forced me to construct everything deliberately. Every partnership, every investment, every contract came with layered protection and calculated exposure. I no longer saw money as security alone, I saw it as a lever, and I learned where to place my hands. Sometimes, late at night, the memory of the man I once was would resurface, tired from double shifts, full of simple dreams, believing love alone could shield him from disaster. I didn't hate that man anymore. I respected him. His sacrifice purchased the education I could not have afforded any other way. But I also knew he could never return. The world he belonged to no longer existed for me. I had stepped into another dimension of consequence, structure, and controlled ambition, and there was no bridge back. By the end of the 5th year after my release, I was no longer rebuilding. I was expanding. My capital moved across multiple sectors and small markets without drawing attention. I learned how to buy debt quietly, how to restructure failing entities, how to position influence without requiring presence. I learned patience at a level that rewired how I experienced time. What once felt like waiting now felt like positioning. And the names I once ran from in pain now sat quietly in my portfolio research folder, waiting for the moment when fate would circle back to them. Rebuilding from scratch taught me lessons no classroom or mentor could ever replicate. Every early morning, I dragged myself out of a tiny apartment that barely had heat and walked streets that felt indifferent to my existence. Every delivery, every construction shift, every night spent stacking boxes or scrubbing floors was a lesson in patience, endurance, and humility. I often returned home physically exhausted, my body screaming for rest, but mentally awake, already calculating the next move, the next investment, the next way to convert time and effort into a leverage that no one could take from me. Exhaustion became fuel, and failure became information. While I was physically working, my mind was building silently. I treated each dollar I earned as if it were the seed of a tree whose shade I would eventually sit under. I learned the power of compounding not only in finance but in skill acquisition and relationships. Every book I could afford, every online course, every person I met became an opportunity to understand a system I had been blind to before. The world had moved without me, and I intended to move faster than it had ever moved while I was absent. I became obsessed, not with vengeance, but with preparation. Some nights, I would sit alone with spreadsheets, learning how small investments could ripple into massive influence. I studied stocks, commodities, startup funding, and alternative assets. I read about risk assessment, market psychology, and legal frameworks for corporate control. Walter's advice, filtered through memory and notes I took secretly while incarcerated, guided me, but now I applied it in real-world scenarios. Each success and each loss in my small-scale investments reinforced the notion that patience and precision were the only weapons I needed to reclaim the life stolen from me. Failure, of course, continued to follow me like a shadow. Early cryptocurrency experiments collapsed overnight, contracts with fledgling entrepreneurs dissolved without warning, and a few attempts to scale small ventures left me financially bruised and mentally exhausted. Each setback felt heavy, but I had learned how to transform frustration into insight. I treated every failure like tuition for a course I couldn't drop. I recorded the reasons for mistakes, analyzed the missteps, and adapted the next strategy to prevent the same errors from repeating. Every loss sharpened my judgment, making me increasingly lethal in business terms. Time passed, and with every calculated decision, my influence grew invisibly. I began to invest in small startups under aliases and intermediary accounts, deliberately separating my past from my emerging empire. My living space upgraded quietly, better furniture, better appliances, no luxury ostentation, only utility. I learned that discretion is the ultimate armor for someone who has been burned by betrayal. Every step was deliberate. Every dollar was positioned strategically. I was no longer surviving, I was quietly preparing to dominate. By the fourth year, my modest investments had multiplied into small-scale wealth that allowed me to participate in larger ventures. I began acquiring shares in companies teetering on failure, quietly restructuring them, streamlining operations, and improving cash flow. I avoided public attention and publicity. I understood that patience was far more powerful than hasty confrontation. While Lena and Mr. Vaughn were likely basking in short-term success, I was building something permanent, an invisible empire that would one day make them reconsider the arrogance they displayed when they believed I had been erased. At night, I reflected on the sacrifices I had made and the betrayal I had endured. The physical pain of early workdays became nothing compared to the emotional torment of watching someone I loved choose another. Yet reflection no longer consumed me with grief. Instead, it informed action. I had learned that emotional energy, when refined into strategy, can create outcomes far more satisfying than fleeting revenge. Each calculation, each disciplined choice, and each incremental gain made me feel more in control than I had ever been when I was young and blindly in love. I also began cultivating a network of advisors and silent partners, carefully selecting individuals whose skill sets complemented mine without ever revealing my true identity. Every contract, every investment, every partnership was structured for maximum flexibility and minimum exposure. I maintained anonymity rigorously. Even Walter's mentorship could not have foreseen the magnitude of planning required to recover from betrayal on such a personal and financial level. I learned that wealth is not just about accumulation, it is about foresight, patience, and precise timing. Without these elements, any victory is fragile. By the fifth and sixth years, my portfolio had grown beyond modest recognition. It included digital assets, international investments, and controlling interests in small but profitable companies. Each acquisition was methodical, designed to strengthen my position without alerting those who once underestimated me. I observed Lena and Mr. Vaughn from a distance, gathering intelligence on their business moves and habits, never out of obsession, but out of preparation. I learned patience not only in finances but in observation. The world's richest people rarely reveal their full power until it is absolute, and I intended to do the same. The day came when I realized that survival and preparation had transformed into dominance. My body, mind, and finances had been rebuilt with a level of precision I had never known before prison. I was no longer the man who had blindly confessed to protect someone else. I was deliberate, disciplined, and equipped to reclaim everything I had lost. Wealth, influence, and strategy now flowed through me like a river I had learned to channel perfectly. I had become something they had never anticipated, a force invisible yet unstoppable, patient yet inevitable, calm yet lethal. Even in solitude, I felt a sense of anticipation that was almost physical. Every investment, every acquisition, every quiet maneuver was approaching its culmination. The men who had thought themselves untouchable were now within reach, their fortunes vulnerable, their overconfidence a weakness I could exploit without revealing my identity. The education prison had forced upon me, combined with relentless application, had produced a man capable of dismantling the life that had betrayed him. I understood now that power is not granted, it is built meticulously, quietly, and with unwavering patience. And I had built it. By the time I was ready to act, everything was in place. Years of calculated moves, patient observation, and silent acquisitions had positioned me perfectly. I had acquired controlling interests in multiple businesses that, at first glance, seemed entirely unrelated to Lena or Mr. Vaughn, but behind the scenes, each one was strategically aligned. Through proxy investors, shell companies, and anonymous accounts, I had built a network of financial influence that allowed me to approach them not as a man of the past, but as a force they could neither see nor predict. Timing was crucial, and I had waited patiently for the perfect moment. I began by purchasing small debts and shares that Mr. Vaughn had casually ignored. He believed himself untouchable, assuming that my prison sentence had erased my presence from any real competition. But as I slowly bought up minor stakes and quietly infiltrated his company's financial ecosystem, I realized the power of invisibility. Each acquisition was methodical, done without alarms or public filings connecting me directly to the transactions. My money, meticulously placed, was transforming into leverage. I didn't need confrontation yet, I needed positioning. By the time he noticed, the outcome would already be inevitable. Every meeting I arranged with financial intermediaries, advisors, and silent partners was carefully calculated to avoid suspicion. I studied Mr. Vaughn's every move in public filings, news reports, and market behavior. I monitored Lena's involvement in social events, press releases, and company appearances, cataloging everything for use later. I observed not out of obsession but out of precision. Each small piece of information became a tool, a lever I could apply at exactly the right moment. I had learned that knowledge without timing is meaningless, and patience without execution is wasted effort. During this time, I also reconnected with my own skills. Years of reading, trial and error, and mentorship had honed my understanding of contracts, debt structures, and corporate governance. I began drafting strategies for hostile yet silent influence. Every letter I sent through attorneys, every acquisition through proxies, every financial maneuver was executed without alerting them to my presence. I wasn't seeking revenge in anger, I was executing justice in calculation. This is the difference between emotional retaliation and strategic reclamation. By the time the public noticed, the work was already done. The first real impact came when Mr. Vaughn's company began experiencing small but consistent pressure from within. Certain debts I had quietly acquired became leverage for influence over operational decisions. Minor shareholders, unaware of my connection, started to question some of his choices. It was subtle. It was slow. It was relentless. And it was invisible. Lena, of course, remained confident, smiling at board meetings and corporate gatherings, blissfully unaware that the empire she had taken for granted was being systematically reclaimed piece by the man she had once betrayed. I found a grim satisfaction in watching the empire unravel silently while they remained oblivious. Every step they took to solidify their position unknowingly deepened my own. Decisions made in arrogance, choices made in complacency, were mistakes I could exploit because I had both patience and preparation on my side. I began to visualize the final moment, the day I would reveal myself not as a vengeful figure, but as the rightful architect of every move that brought them to the brink. Everything they thought was secure had been temporarily rented by my patience. There were nights I reflected on the irony of it all. I had spent years in prison, losing everything, and the very people who believed they had profited from my absence were now unwittingly funding my return to prominence. Lena's betrayal and Mr. Vaughn's overconfidence had been essential components in the construction of my ultimate advantage. I realized then that patience, discipline, and strategy could outperform anger, impulse, and arrogance every single time. They were writing their own downfall while I silently documented the process, preparing to execute the final stage with precision. The final acquisition was simple in execution but monumental in impact. I purchased a controlling share of the parent company's stock through intermediaries and legal channels, enough to legally exercise authority over corporate decisions. The moment I finalized it, the subtle pressures I had been applying escalated into a decisive edge. Minor investors, unaware of my identity, followed my lead. Financial leverage shifted in my favor. The company was, in effect, mine, long before Lena or Mr. Vaughn even suspected the name behind the silent moves. I had bought my past with money they believed was theirs, using patience as my currency. The final board meeting arrived with a calm that contrasted with the storm inside me. Mr. Vaughn entered, confident, arrogant, assuming total control. Lena was beside him, radiant in her ignorance, completely unaware that the man they believed destroyed and erased from existence was now sitting quietly in the wings as the unseen architect of their reality. I had chosen the timing deliberately. I wanted the reveal to be complete, undeniable, and irreversible. Every calculated step had led to this moment, and I intended to maximize the impact of their recognition of my presence and authority. When I finally entered the boardroom, they saw me but did not recognize me at first. The years had transformed me. I walked deliberately, eyes calm, posture confident, aura of control unmistakable. Lena's smile faltered immediately. Mr. Vaughn froze, a split second of confusion crossing his face, the kind that happens when someone believes they have calculated all possibilities only to discover an unpredictable variable has already won. The room went silent, and in that moment, I knew that patience, planning, and preparation had delivered a victory that anger alone could never achieve. I had bought my past with quiet, relentless precision. The betrayal that once felt like an unhealable wound had been converted into the very foundation of my return. The empire, the wealth, the influence, they were mine. And Lena, the woman who emptied our accounts, stood beside the man she believed she could rely on, unaware that the man she had discarded was now holding the ultimate power. For the first time in years, I felt a satisfaction deeper than vengeance, the satisfaction of complete, strategic reclamation. The next move, of course, would be the final one, and it would be just as deliberate. When the boardroom door closed behind me, Lena's eyes widened in disbelief. She glanced at Mr. Vaughn, whose confident posture faltered for the first time I had ever witnessed. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The air itself carried the weight of every calculated year, every investment, every sleepless night I had endured. Silence amplified the revelation. The man they believed powerless and erased was standing there, in control, holding authority over decisions they had once assumed were untouchable. I let the moment stretch, letting panic and shock settle into their expressions without interruption. I began with calm statements, introducing myself as the majority stakeholder of the company they had taken for granted. I explained, deliberately and measuredly, how years of silent acquisitions and strategic positioning had allowed me to acquire authority legally and invisibly. Lena's mouth opened, then closed, her face blanching as she tried to form words. Mr. Vaughn's confident gaze wavered. I emphasized the subtlety of my approach, the patience that ensured no one noticed my moves until the final moment. Every word was designed to reinforce the point: the empire they believed secured was entirely under my control. Their attempts to respond were disorganized, desperate, and ineffective. Lena tried to speak first, her voice shaking as she stammered apologies and explanations. I listened without interruption, aware that no words could undo her betrayal. Mr. Vaughn attempted to assert authority, citing contracts and previous control, but I interrupted only once to outline the legal structures that made my position unassailable. The calmness in my tone contrasted sharply with the panic and confusion in theirs. Every movement, every word, every gesture was deliberate. I wanted them to understand the cost of their arrogance. I then presented evidence of their financial missteps that had unknowingly benefited me. I displayed documents showing how debts they ignored had quietly transferred control to me, how minor shareholders had followed my lead without realizing the implications, and how each of their actions had tightened my grip on the company. Lena's hands trembled as she realized the scale of what had happened. Mr. Vaughn's usually sharp face was pale. They had built their empire on overconfidence and assumed loyalty, and I had systematically dismantled it without them even noticing until the final, undeniable moment. I offered them a choice, not out of mercy, but to demonstrate my authority and strategic patience. They could either cooperate under my guidance to stabilize the company, or face the consequences of legal action and public exposure. Lena's betrayal and Mr. Vaughn's arrogance had provided me leverage beyond simple financial power. I made it clear that I was not seeking petty revenge or humiliation, but complete strategic dominance. They were forced to recognize that the man they once discarded was now indispensable to the survival of the empire they thought they controlled completely. The reality of the situation settled in gradually, and I could see the emotional unraveling. Lena's expression shifted from fear to shame to disbelief. Mr. Vaughn's demeanor oscillated between incredulity and forced composure. The shift in power was total, silent, and undeniable. I had waited years for this precise moment, not out of malice, but as the natural consequence of discipline, patience, and strategic execution. Everything they had assumed about my weakness was exposed as naive. Every underestimation of my capacity became the foundation for my triumph. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice. I allowed them to experience the shock fully. The satisfaction of this victory was not in punishment but in the confirmation of planning and execution. The man who had been powerless, betrayed, and financially ruined had rebuilt himself from nothing and executed the perfect reclamation. Every financial decision, every acquisition, every calculated step of the past years culminated in this exact moment. The power I had amassed was invisible until revealed, and the shock on their faces made the precision of the year's work tangible. Finally, I outlined my future plans for the company and my intentions for maintaining operational stability. I allowed them to understand that while I held ultimate authority, cooperation could ensure continued growth and success. Lena and Mr. Vaughn realized that their mistakes had created an opportunity not only for me to dominate but also for them to learn a harsh lesson about underestimating those they believed powerless. The transformation of shock into comprehension was slow, painful, and unavoidable, demonstrating the real cost of betrayal, arrogance, and short-sightedness. As I left the boardroom that day, the silence of my triumph was complete. Lena no longer smiled. Mr. Vaughn no longer exuded confidence. I walked through the corridors of the company with authority now fully recognized, knowing that the years of patient rebuilding, silent maneuvering, and strategic discipline had culminated perfectly. The lesson was clear: betrayal can be transformed into opportunity, patience can be converted into power, and careful, deliberate action can reclaim everything lost without exposing weakness. In that moment, I understood that my story was no longer about loss, it was about calculated, inevitable victory. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.